Thanks and welcome to the folks who are joining us on Zoom. Always appreciate you guys being part of the crowd as well. And to my students who are in Oil and Gas Law 1 and 2, remember, if you want credit for being here today, you have to come down and sign in on my attendance sheet down front here. Also, I think David Berta handed out for us, to those who didn't pick up a copy, a bingo card. So if you got a bingo card, that's going to be part of today's presentation. So you might want to get that handy or share with your neighbor, that kind of thing, and have fun with that. And then we'll have one more of these in the Energy Law Lecture Series in April. That'll be on Monday, April 13th. And those of you who are also interested in attending our Nuts and Bolts series, our next Nuts and Bolts will be this Friday at noon in room 202 with Lana Straub with the National Association of Royalty Owners. And then we'll have Kyle Reynolds in April from the American Association of Professional Landmen. So those are other ways to listen to speakers that are coming to our law school to talk about energy law practice and what happens out there in the wild world after you graduate. So take advantage of those opportunities if you get a chance. All right, I think that's everything on administration, except now I'm thinking about it, we've got a QR code that'll pop up at the end of the lecture for those of you who want CLE credit with the State Bar of Texas. So just stay tuned and you can use your phone to get that QR code at the end of the lecture. Okay, so let me introduce our guest speaker today. It's Courtney Hjaltman, who's one of our 5 commissioners on the Public Utility Commission of Texas in Austin, and she brought with her a couple of folks from her staff who are tech law grads. We have Julie Davis and we have Preston Striffler, both law school grads. I actually got to teach Julie Davis, and so it's kind of fun to have these folks here with us today as well. But they're all here to promote the PUC and job opportunities there and to give you guys a better idea of what that looks like if you're interested in pursuing a clerkship, internship, or permanent employment after you graduate. So be sure and take advantage of that as well. Down here where my attendance sheets are, I think Julie's put out her business card, so you can also pick up a business card and follow up with her later if you have questions about that. So Courtney Hjaltman, Commissioner on the Public Utility Commission. She was appointed to the PUC by Governor Abbott on June 24th, 2024, a couple of years ago, and was confirmed in May of 2025. As a commissioner, she oversees regulatory matters affecting Texas's electric, water, and telecommunications industries. Prior to her appointment to the PUC, Hjaltman served as chief executive and public counsel for the Office of Public Utility Counsel, OPUC, where she led the agency's representation of residential and small commercial consumers before the PUC, the State Office of Administrative Hearings, state courts, and ERCOT, the Electric Reliability Council of Texas. She worked during this past legislative session on landmark legislation to improve ERCOT grid reliability and to establish the state's first weatherization requirements for generation of resources. As you guys know from Winter Storm Uri and every summer and winter that we have any extreme weather, everybody immediately wonders, are we going to have electricity? So that's the job she is part of with 4 other commissioners, and so obviously it's a pretty important job that she has for us. The title of her talk today is Weathering the Electricity Storm. Please help me welcome Courtney Hjaltman.
Hey guys, thank you all so much. I'm really excited to be here with you today. I'm excited to be back in a law school. It's been a long time since I was in a law school classroom. Just give you a little bit of background. The PUC, you might have heard of it, but back a few years ago, no one knew what the PUC was. It was a little agency that got little attention. It got little notoriety at the Capitol. And then a storm called Winter Storm Uri hit. And so that's kind of, see if I can make this slide work. I've already broken it. Sorry. Oh, it's not going. What is she got? That's okay. She's giving all my good slides away. Don't look. You want to come up here and run it, Julie? Yeah. That's okay. I don't know any better. Where are the arrows? Oh, I can do that. Okay. Okay. Got it. Okay, so back in the day, no one knew who we were, which is why this is a little funny, right? We ran under the radar. Winter Storm Uri hit. Everybody knew who PUC was. Now, every time there's cold weather, you're on the news, you see, will the ERCOT grid make it? We don't know. When it's hot out, we're talking about ERCOT, we're talking about the PUC, and the legislature definitely knows who we are because they basically have legislation about us every session. Now we're apparently kind of a big deal. But like many back in 2021, I did not know what the PUC was. I worked for Governor Greg Abbott. I was in his legislative affairs division, running all his policy through the office. I got everything that he wanted to get passed. I worked with the members. I worked with all the members, the representatives and senators on things that were important to them. And at the end of session would make sure that they were constitutional in the eyes of the governor so that when we got to the end, we didn't have to veto any of those bills. So I was kind of a liaison between the governor and the members, and I loved doing that job. But because Winter Storm Uri came, I got a front row seat to PUC, to ERCOT, to understanding the grid really fast because I had to answer all those questions. And then I ended up working in electricity. So I give you that background kind of to say by being in a class about electricity, by being in this room right now, you're actually further than I was in my career when I started. I didn't take electricity law, and that was a class they offered. I took oil and gas, but it wasn't anything like regulatory and electricity. So you're doing great, leaps and bounds ahead of where I was. So today I'm going to talk to you about the PUC. It's the agency that regulates your electricity. It's obviously a pretty big deal, something important to everybody in the state, in the country. It's important to Governor Abbott for the economic regulation. And I'm going to talk to you about the ERCOT market, right? And what we've been doing in the market and lately at the PUC. The topic can be pretty dense. It has a lot of engineer terms, so we're trying to add a little bit of humor throughout, have some funny slides, and you have a bingo card to follow along with. Those are the key words that you'll kind of hear today. Again, just trying to add a little bit for you to follow. So we'll get started. This is a map of the United States and Texas. I hope you already knew that. Yes? Maybe? Okay. Guys, it's dense. You got to kind of work with me a little bit. But okay, this is a map of ERCOT. That's what Texas. You have a mark, you'll see the United States, and it shows all the ISOs and RTOs. There are 9 RTOs and ISOs in the United States. You have CAISO, which is California and goes a little bit into Nevada, Northwest. You have Southwest, SPP, MISO, Southeast, PJM, and the New York ISO. And then you also have ERCOT. When you look at Texas, you will notice that not all of Texas is that blue color. That's because not all of Texas is in ERCOT, right? You have a part of East Texas, which is in the El Paso region, that is in what we call WECC, W-E-C-C. You go North Texas, up in the Panhandle, that is in SPP, and that goes all the way to Oklahoma, Kansas, and upwards. And then in the southeast area of Texas, you have Beaumont, and outside of Houston called the Woodlands, and that is in the MISO region. And then the rest of Texas is what makes up ERCOT. About 90% of Texas does make up ERCOT, and let me tell you why that's important. The electric grid of Texas, ERCOT itself does not go outside of any portion of Texas. You'll notice that blue is all within Texas, and that means it's all intrastate. That's a key word. Obviously, you've probably heard that in some of your law school classes. Like intrastate means, obviously it's not connecting or going across any of those state boundaries, right? So when we talk about it being intrastate and not going across boundaries, that's really important to ERCOT. That's really important to us at the PUC. It's really important to the Texas legislature because that means it has minimal federal jurisdiction issues. Because of the minimal federal regulation, the PUC and Texas legislature are who are in control of ERCOT. They control the market. They control the policies that we implement at the PUC. And we like it that way. They fight really hard to keep it that way. But that also means that ERCOT is sort of an island. When when there is an energy issue, when there's electricity issues, we have minimal ability to bring that power across state lines. There are a few lines that cross, but it's pretty minimal. So that is one downfall. But otherwise, it's very beneficial that we have that ability to be isolated. So this is a pretty classic movie. Does anybody know what this is from? Okay, I think I heard some mumbles. So Office Space, right? What would you say you do here exactly? So who is ERCOT and what do they do? ERCOT is the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, and they are responsible for managing the flow of electricity on the Texas grid, right? They're the air traffic controller and controlling those transmission lines. They don't own anything. They don't own any generation. They don't own any of the transmission lines. They are simply there to make sure one set of the power from one area of Texas is getting to the other part. Their main focus is reliability of the Texas electric grid and keeping the lights on for us every day. That's their main job. They do monitor transmission lines for congestion because there's a limit to how much energy can flow on each line. They also make sure energy generated in one part of the state is able to flow to other parts of the state. They keep an eye on the frequency of the grid, which is a very delicate balance that we'll talk more about shortly. They run the competitive wholesale market, right? The grid is actually a market in itself. People purchase the generation and they have to sell it, and that money all flows through ERCOT. They conduct many studies and they decide what transmission is built with the TSPs, the transmission utility providers, and they're doing all the data and collection of that. And then the PUC itself is who is responsible for ERCOT. They answer to us. We tell them what they can do. We do the policy decisions, and they implement them. We decide their budget and approve it. Any major decisions, there are changes they're going to make to how they run the electric grid comes through the PUC. So that's our responsibility over them. So you might hear Texas be referred to as a competitive market because that's what it is. Texas is a competitive energy market. And let's talk about what that means. Prior to 1999, were any of you even born in 1999? Oh my God. Okay, well, congratulations. Thank you, Rod. All right, prior to 1999, utility companies in Texas were all vertically integrated. What that means is that the generators were all owned by the same company, and they owned transmission lines, and they also were your retail electric provider. They were all one company. You dealt with one company at a time. You didn't deal with many different companies, and they all owned the same assets. In 1999, the Texas legislature and then Governor George W. Bush decided, let's think about that, let's change it. We're gonna deregulate this Texas market. And it was pretty new concept at the time to come up with this. Now other markets do follow, but it was pretty new at the time. Generation was deregulated, so that means that one company owns the generation. We in Texas don't tell them where to build it. We don't tell them what type of generation to build. They decide that. They have investors that make that decision. They decide if it's worth it to invest. If they see that they will get a return on their investment, they'll go ahead and make that decision. And it's the market that drives whether or not they think they should make those investments, right? Then we have the transmission and distribution. Those are the poles and wires. That's what you see when you're driving down the road. That's what carries the electricity back and forth. And at the time, and even now, the decision was made that there's really no benefit to actually deregulating that. We're going to leave that owned by the same companies because to rebuild billions of dollars in infrastructure across the state really wouldn't be beneficial to any Texans. It would cost a lot of money. So that is one area that is still regulated, and the PUC is who regulates that. We set their rates. They come to us and ask where they should be building the new transmission lines, and we make those siting decisions. So it is still a fully regulated part of the framework. And then the last part of it is retail electric providers. We call those reps. And reps are who you interact with daily. That's who, if your electricity goes out, that's who you call. When you get a bill in the mail, if you get it in the mail or you get it over email, you get that from your rep. That is who has the direct contact, right? This was really innovative at the time and is still very innovative. And the reason behind deregulation was that different companies that come into the market will really drive competition and give better customer care and provide better benefit to the customers, right? When you go to the grocery store, you have many options of what cereal you buy. And that way you can pick and choose what you buy. That was the same idea between the retail competition. You could go and you could select your provider. You could select a provider if you wanted only green energy, and most of it would be provided by wind or solar. You could pick that. If you wanted energy that was only sold on days that end in Y, you could pick that as well. You would do shopping, and that would really drive competition. And that's what they got out of this. It's worked really well. Texas has some of the lower electricity prices. And so we're pretty proud of what we led with. Now, not all of Texas is in the deregulated construct. There are cities like San Antonio, previously the city of Lubbock, did not select to be deregulated. And then there's also co-ops throughout the state that also are still vertically integrated. But 75% of Texas customers are in the retail electric, providing they go and choose their rep. They're in a deregulated market. I said Lubbock was recently just in the they chose to opt in. So if you were here a few years ago, you had Lubbock Power and Light. Now you went online, you chose your rep, you chose who you wanted to have be your retail electric provider, and you shopped for the better benefit. And hopefully you're going to see some benefit from that. Okay. Again, I told you it was a little dry, so this is our little attempt at a joke. What do you get when you don't balance supply and demand on your power lines? You have Hertz donut. You know, Hertz, like, no, sorry, Preston. Sorry. All right, how about this one? Anybody know who that actor is? It's old. And if you know the movie, you automatically get a prize. What if there is too much demand and not enough supply? It's a very valid question. It's actually something ERCOT worries about every day. It's something I stay up and worry about, right? And it's a major principle of economics. I'm not an economist, but I will tell you supply and demand in the electric market is something vital to understand, and it's a balancing act every day. Supply and demand have to stay in balance in any market, right? It doesn't matter if you're in the electricity market or not, but it's even more so in the electric market because there's a constant frequency you have to keep on the grid. If there's too much supply and there's not a people that need it, that's the demand side, you'll have a frequency issue. If there's too much demand and not enough supply, you'll have a frequency issue. And thus you have to have that constant balance going on. In law school, do y'all still talk about widgets in contracts? Yes, I know. I don't know what it is either, but it's still a thing. Okay. So you talk about widgets, and widgets are made in a factory, and you can go and you can store them, right? You can put them in the back, and if someone comes in and says, I need 10 widgets, you can go in the back room, you can sell them those 10 widgets. Electricity is not like that. Electricity is an immediate need. They have to produce it in real time, and it has to be immediately used. Until recently, there was no way to store that, right? Now we do have storage. It's not enough, so we can't really depend on it to run our grid, but that's why there's that. You have to know how much supply and how much demand, and that's where forecasting comes in, okay? And forecasting is one of the major components of what ERCOT does. Forecasting is looking at how much demand they know is always on the grid because there's always those customers. Looking at the weather for the day, is it gonna be super hot? Is it gonna be super cold? Looking at historical factors, like on this day, it got to be this hot. And also looking at the weather of, will we have wind? Will we have sun? Will we have the solar and the wind we count on? And they put that forecast out, and it's in 15-second increments, and it's every hour of the day, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, they're putting this constant information out, right? And we depend on that forecast for our supply and demand. So how's it going? What have we been doing since we've kind of done some of these things? I talked to you about supply and demand, and that grid was running pretty okay. It was pretty normal. We deregulated, and in 1999, again, prior to all of you being born, which thank you for letting me know how old you are, the Texas legislature also decided to set a goal for renewables in the state of Texas. And this is really important to talk about because it really spearheaded where we are today in our resource mix, and that means what makes up our generation capacity, right? What are the things that make our lights turn on every day? So in 2005, the Texas legislature set a goal of 10,000 megawatts of wind energy. At the time, solar was not around, so it was only wind that they were talking about. Just to give you an idea, 1 megawatt of electricity is enough to power about 250 homes during peak time. So 10,000 megawatts would be about 2.5 million homes. So with that goal, it really spearheaded and drove investors to make those investments in the market to get to work with the wind turbines. But as you know, supply and demand, like we talked about, all of that doesn't happen in a vacuum. And one of the important factors of any supply is getting it to the demand and to the load center. So enter CREZ, the Competitive Renewable Energy Zone. So when we talk about renewables, you know, here in Lubbock, you see the wind turbines, you see them moving, hopefully most of the time, but not all the time. But you know that a lot of wind is in West Texas. You know, a lot of wind is on the coast. You know, a lot of solar is where there's land available, which happens to also be in West Texas, right? And all of these resources that are on and or depend on nature happen to be where the load, i.e. the demand, i.e. the big cities aren't at, right? So if you'll look at this map, you will see that there's a bunch of red lines. They are starting in West Texas and they are heading east towards centers of population. And that happens to be where all the wind and solar was, right? Well, it's wind at this time. And so there was a massive push by the Texas legislature and the industry to build transmission lines to help get the renewable resources to the city hubs. There was this was building about 3,000 miles of new transmission lines, these new CREZ lines. And that was done between about 2007 to 2013. And after the completion of these lines, you'll see on the left, that's y'all's right, you'll see the depiction of wind increasing, right? It shows 2000 to 2017. Wind continued to increase after 2017, but this just really shows, right? In 2005, the legislature set the goal. They started to get the materials. They really started to see the increase. And then in 2013 is when CREZ was completed and the wind continued to come to the Texas market because there was the want and the need. The land was available and they had a way to transport it, which are very important components of the market. Okay. This is showing you depiction of renewable energy in Texas, but also kind of the change in our generation mix. These graphs, or if you look at the circle graph, you will see natural gas in 2013 was 54% and coal was 24% and then nuclear was 6%. So over 75%, almost 80% of our generation mix in 2013 was what we call dispatchable generation, thermal dispatchable generation. That means it is a switch that you can flip. It's something that doesn't depend on nature. It doesn't depend on the wind. It doesn't depend on the sun to make the energy. It is something that we can turn on and off. 13 years later, in 2016, natural gas is at 37%, and coal is only at 7.6%. That is about 42% when it was about 13 years ago. Wind and solar make up the remaining, and then what we have really starting to grow is batteries, which is 8.6. That's that red/maroon color on your far right of the slide. Now that's really increasing. That's grown in about 2 or 3 years, has gone to 8.6%. So that's a huge jump. It's really helpful to us in the market. But the big change is showing you is that thermal generation has decreased significantly, and wind and solar is what's really picked up, right, and been what's built here in Texas right now. Today, Texas is the #1 provider of wind energy in the U.S., and we are second only to California in solar. You combine them, we are the #1 state for renewables. I go and speak to states all over the U.S., and they always are asking, how did you get so much renewable? What did you do? What is it that y'all do in Texas to get so much? And then also, how do you get so many batteries to come to your market? We want to have that as well. And unfortunately, I have to tell them our market is what drives and incentivizes these resources. Our state happens to have a lot of land. It's cheap land out in the area, so there's not a natural barrier in having too much population in the area. Our regulation is easier to come to Texas, and then also we just happen to be better as a state to work with, right? So because our energy market and incentives provide the low regulatory framework, it drives the incentives here, and it's just an easier thing for us to get. Batteries happen to follow renewable. They saw the benefit, and again, the incentives were there for them to invest themselves. But as we know, sometimes the sun doesn't shine, Sometimes the wind doesn't blow, so 60% of the time, it works every time. And when that's the issue we have, we sometimes get weather like this, and we have issues we have to deal with. So in February 2021, Winter Storm Uri caused sub-freezing temperatures and snowfall that simultaneously triggered record electricity demand and widespread generation outages. Nearly 70% of Texans were without power at some point during the storm. The grid was minutes away from total failure or blackout. Over half of the generation tripped offline. We experienced frozen infrastructure that included gas pipelines, that included compressors because they weren't weatherized, and then we also had wind turbines that were frozen. We ran into cycles of generators not being able to come back on because they required gas to come on and make electricity, but the gas needed electricity to run and pump gas and to pressurize, and so they were in an endless cycle, an endless loop where they couldn't help each other because neither one was with power. So this chart is depicting kind of what we saw during Winter Storm Uri. Again, you will see that over 50 gigawatts at one point was offline. So that's where over 50% of our resources were offline. And the major part of it was that they were weather related, right? So something was frozen, they couldn't turn on, some type of issue. The darker blue is equipment issues. The green is fuel limitations, so they were unable to get the gas they needed. And then just miscellaneous and transmission issues were the very small component at the bottom. But anytime you look at numbers like this would cause anyone to have concern, right? The storm, the issues we saw, the lives lost, really caused the legislature to take a deep look. They held hearings, multiple hearings for the next weeks after Winter Storm Uri. And in the end, the legislature and the governor ended up issuing an ultimatum of never again. Never again can we have this type of issue. Never again can the grid go close to blackout. Never again can we lose the lives like we lost after Winter Storm Uri. Fix it and fix it now. And so the PUC and ERCOT and the legislature stepped in. And this is one of my favorite quotes. "I'm from the government and I'm here to help," by Ronald Reagan. It's a classic. But we were the government, we were there to help, and we got to work. As you can see, and as you probably know, every hardship, every emergency, every storm, there are lessons learned, and what followed were lessons that we learned from Winter Storm Uri, and we also had massive reform we went through. Some of the massive reform included ERCOT got an entirely new board of directors. It had previously been industry run. Now it is all independent board members. The PUC went from 3 commissioners to 5 commissioners, and also we got all new commissioners at the time. The PUC worked to adopt rigorous weatherization standards based on regional wind temperatures, and ERCOT goes out every year prior to winter weather and looks at the generators and makes sure that they have followed those standards and that they are ready for every storm. We now coordinate with the Department of Emergency Management, known as TEDM. We have what is called TERC calls, the Texas Energy Reliability Council, and that gets agencies that deal with weather. So we have TxDOT, so they're dealing with roads. We have the Railroad Commission, who obviously does oil and gas. We have the PUC, who's doing electricity. We have TEDM, who works with the state on all disasters, and TCEQ, who's the Environmental Quality Agency. We're all on the phone prior to storms, during storms, communicating, talking about who has needs, and we make sure those needs are met so that we don't run into any issues. We made changes to our ORDC to better value electricity during times of disaster. We now have a map of all critical infrastructure in the state so that we know where the generation is. We know what should be turned off and not be turned off when we do have load shed events, and that helps us prepare better. So we worked through a number of other issues as well, and one of them was realizing that everyone loves LAMP, like Brick from Anchorman, right? And we needed to think about why there was such generation issues during Uri. And so the legislature really thought and looked at our generation mix and what we had to work with, and they saw how much of our generation was coming from renewables, which you can see here in 2015 to 2024. You do see an increase in generation capacity, right? We went from just over probably about 90 megawatts to close to 150, which is a great increase. But the fact of the matter is it comes from all wind and it comes from all solar. And again, wind and solar being great and what they are, we love a good resource mix of everything. We are to take all, but we also realize we need some that are flip the switch, turn on, they're there when we can count on them. And those resources, the thermal dispatchable resources, are actually declining every year. Coal is obviously decreasing. That's the brown in the chart. Those are going offline as they have been past their permit periods. The dark blue and purple are pretty much gas generation. Those have stayed pretty steady and or will decrease soon. They have a capacity life, so they have how many years they can work before they have to actually go offline. So they've stayed steady, but what we're looking at is in the future, they are all reaching their age limit and they will be turning off. So we needed to find a way to look at how we can incentivize again and be the market that we are for generation that is thermal dispatchable to turn itself and to build in Texas. So doing that, we identified better ways to incentivize, and the Texas legislature in 2023 passed, and the Texas electorate voted for a constitutional amendment, and that created the Texas Energy Fund. That is a fund that is held at the PUC, at the commission where I work. And for the past 3 years, we have been screening various projects. They are allowed to get a generation loan from us, and they are now through that process. We have actually handed them all giant checks, some of them, and they're starting to break ground. And hopefully in the next few years, you will see that gas generation number and that blue and purple start to grow a little bit. That's our goal. Okay, so the state of Texas, we actually use more energy than any other state. Probably not that surprising. There are other states that obviously have about the same population as we do, but the fact of the matter is they don't have the type of weather we do. They don't have to run their AC quite as much as we do during the summer. So they are not as demanding on the electricity grid as we are. Another factor to keep in mind when you're talking about the state of Texas is that we have a lot of industrial growth and a lot of industrial users in our state, right? The governor of Texas loves that we are a beacon of the economy. People want to build here, but when they build here, that's a lot of electricity they need to use. We have in West Texas, we have oil and gas. That uses a lot of electricity. That is then transferred over to the coast and it's turned into LNG. That uses a lot of electricity. We have giant steel mills throughout the state. We have other large industrial consumers. They all use a lot of electricity. So what we want you to see in this chart is that from 2015 to 2025, so in just 10 years, we grew from 69,000 megawatts to over really 85,000. 2025 was pretty mild as far as winter weather, but we usually look at the summer weather to hit our peak, and that was just over 85,000 megawatts. That's a huge increase in load, even for Texas. Other states stay pretty stagnant and steady in their load growth. So that we're seeing that growth in just 10 years is pretty significant. So the state of Texas and the legislature saw that there was all this growth, and they also heard about data centers coming recently. And so they kind of told us we need to get to work. We have some issues to work on, and we need to build more transmission. We need to build more generation. So they told us to go ahead and get to work on that. And so we did, right? Recognizing that we were in a pivotal moment in Texas history, recognizing that the Texas economy really depends on electricity, recognizing electrification of oil and gas in the Permian Basin, recognizing data centers and Bitcoin mining were all very significant here and growing in Texas. We knew that something needed to be done. So in 2023, the 88th legislature passed House Bill 5066, which directed the PUC and ERCOT to engage in targeted regional transmission planning. And that turned out to be basically the Permian Basin Reliability Plan. And that is basically an energy superhighway. It starts in West Texas, as you'll see in the graph, and goes to East Texas. It's those green lines on Texas throughout. ERCOT proposed this to the PUC. We voted on it and approved it. And after looking at various plans that were presented to us by ERCOT, we adopted extra high voltage lines, 765 kV lines. That was the first time for 765 to be built in the state of Texas. It's the largest transmission lines we've ever built in Texas. So we're very excited to see that these lines will enhance the efficiency. They will allow greater capacity on the lines because they are bigger. They will accommodate greater rapid growth in the state of Texas and help with long-term congestion that we will be seeing in the few years coming. So like I mentioned, obviously, the legislature noticed that there was a lot of growth coming in data centers. You probably see an article in the newspaper almost every day about the large growth coming to Texas, the data centers coming to Texas. What are we going to do? Some of these data centers can consume up to 1 gigawatt of electricity, just one data center. That's almost the size of probably Lubbock coming onto the grid every day. So if you look at this chart, first you'll see what is a data center. It's amazing to think that that is what will suck over 1 gigawatt of electricity. It is just a giant room with computers filled in it, and they are computers that are always on, so they're always running, they're always hot. You have to keep them at a certain temperature, so they're constantly sucking electricity from the grid. On the right shows the connection queue for ERCOT. The connection queues is for large customers that want to come to the state of Texas, and they're asking to connect to the grid. This is ERCOT's job, right? They decide who gets to connect to the grid every time, and they are looking at the grid, deciding if there is enough capacity, if there is enough generation, if there is enough transmission capability at the time for them to connect. What you can see is that in 2022 is a small, very small green line. You can probably barely see it. And that was the connection queue in 2022. A few years later, in 2025, that tripled. 2026, it doubled, triple yet again, and it's projected to continue to triple in the years to come. So seeing these numbers and hearing from ERCOT about the issues with interconnection, the legislature adopted Senate Bill 6 in the last legislative session in 2025. This legislation provides the PUC and ERCOT the tools they need to establish new standards for interconnecting loads and for forecasting growth. It also provides the necessary tools to decide when these loads are real or phantom, because that's a huge problem we see is that we don't know which of these loads is actually going to build. Some of them are just playing in the market just because, right? So because of this rapid growth, ERCOT has been reevaluating the standards and the planning process for which they allow these facilities to join the grid. We've had a couple of dozen connecting to the grid each year. That was very possible for them to study them, but now that it is such a large load coming and so many requesting to join the grid, they are needing to look at their processes again. And so under development right now at the PUC, we are working on what is called a batch process. This batch process will ensure transmission to serve these customers without putting existing customers at risk. So that is kind of what we've been doing. Myra Rose says, thank you for being here, thank you for joining us. And just because Texas Tech loves a good tortilla, we have a lovely tortilla with a transmission line. Thank you, ChatGPT, for that lovely use of electricity, and for my staff, the tech grads, they insisted we give a shout out to our tortilla. And as I know you want your credit, here is your CLE barcode as well. I do have a few minutes. If you have questions, I'm happy to answer any that you might have before you run out of here.
Questions for Commissioner Hjaltman?
Like it. Yes.
Hello. Wait, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. I was curious how the PUC is dealing with the current issue of the amount of wind turbines that are coming down currently or are going to be coming down in the next coming years, and the amount of waste that is accumulating both in Sweetwater and beyond.
Very good question. For those that couldn't hear, it was about the wind turbines that are coming down, so they're aging out, and so they're being taken down from being up and used, and what will happen to them. It's a good question. I know there was legislation this past session that I think actually addressed it. Is it a rule? I'm looking at my staff. A rule we have to do anything on? TCQ. So since it's an always fun to say it's another agency's. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, TCEQ, is who is working on that. It's responsible for it as it's something more in their wheelhouse. But it's something we keep an eye on as well because it's obviously a downfall of wind turbines. So good question. Any other questions? Okay. Well, when you do all graduate, remember the PUC. If you want to practice electricity, we will happy to talk to you, or be here if you want to come talk to any 2 tech grads that did work, go to law school here and work in electricity now. But we're happy to talk to you more. Oh yeah, and if you got a bingo, come down. We do have prizes. We're state employees, so they're not amazing, but you know, you can annoy your next professor by having them in the classroom if you want to. So come on down if you got a bingo.
All right, thanks for joining us. You guys who are on Zoom and need the CLE, be sure and check the QR code. Thanks for joining us.